Hey everybody, this is Russ from RetroGameCore. A couple months ago I did a video showcasing all the cool emulation stuff you can do on a Mac. And that video got a lot of feedback asking for me to make a guide to show off how I set everything up. And so that's what we're going to cover in this video today. I'm going to show you how to emulate just about every system you can think of using an M series Mac. I'm going to use my M4 Mac Mini, but if you've got anything with the M chip inside, including an iMac or a MacBook Pro or a MacBook Air, all those are going to work. Now this is going to be a longer video, but I'm going to break it up into chapters for each of the different emulators, and so if you have a specific system that you want to try out, you can just jump directly to that. And we're going to wrap everything up in a lovely front-end system called Emulation Station Desktop Edition. This will allow us to navigate through all of our games and launch them through a seamless single interface. We've got a lot of ground to cover, so grab your favorite snack and drink, and let's go ahead and get started. Okay, before we get started with the actual guide, I did want to talk about one app that might be of use to you. This one is called OpenEmu, and it's actually a really nice self-contained emulator app for more retro-based systems. It's not able to emulate some of the higher-end systems like we'll be covering in this guide, but it will go up to like GameCube and PSP. And so if you are looking to have just a small library of retro games specifically, then this might be a better tool because it is a lot easier to set up. To get started, just go to their website and download the app, and then drag the app from your downloads folder over into your applications folder. And when you try to open it up, you might get a prompt to install Rosetta. This is a tool that allows you to use apps like OpenEmu that were made originally for Intel-based Macs, but you can use them on M series chips as well. And so if you do see a prompt like this when installing this app or any others like it, then I would recommend installing it. And you only have to do it one time. After that, Rosetta will take care of the rest. Now, even after installing Rosetta, when you try to open up this app, it's going to give you a permissions error. And the latest version of macOS has been really restrictive about this, so we have to use a bit of a workaround to get some of these apps running. And to do this, you'll have to open up your system settings and then scroll down on the left down to privacy and security. Within this window, if you scroll all the way down to the bottom, you'll see a prompt there that says the app was blocked to protect your Mac. And what you want to do here is just click on the Open Anyway button. This will bring up another prompt, and now it'll say Open Anyway again. From there, you'll have to type in your account password, and then it should open up. Now, this app is also unique in that it requires you to receive keystrokes from the application. So again, we'll have to go into our system settings, and then it'll bring up input monitoring. You just turn this one on and then use your password again, and then it's going to ask you to quit the app and then reopen it. After that, we are finally set up. Now in the first screen, it's going to ask you which cores do you want to have installed. These are going to be like the emulator backends. And by default, they're all going to be selected. And honestly, these are all pretty small file sizes too. So it's probably just easy to just keep them all checked. But if you want to uncheck certain systems, you can do that as well. From there, on the left, you will see a list of all the consoles, and you can just drag and drop your ROM files into here and then launch them. So as an example here, I've got my Game Boy Advance catalog, so I'm just going to move over one of my games here. Let's do Astro Boy. And so once I drag it over here, I can go into the Game Boy Advance section, and there it is. It even has the box art and everything. And at that point, all you have to do is just double click and it should start up the game. There are other things you'll have to do, like connecting a controller and stuff like that. We'll talk about that later. But in a nutshell, that is how OpenEmu works. And so it's a pretty simple system altogether. It also has things like shaders and save states, and you can go full screen. So all the things that you would want in just a very basic emulation experience. Now, one thing of note, when you drag and drop a game over into OpenEmu, it'll make a copy of it and put it within the OpenEmu file system. And this could potentially take up a large amount of storage if you have a very large library. So personally, I think that OpenEmu works best when you're only going to be playing a select few games, so that way you can keep your storage in check. Either way, I wanted to show how OpenEmu works in case this is a better fit for you. Now, on the other hand, let me show you a best case scenario of what everything's going to look like after you go through the rest of this guide. We're going to use a front end called Emulation Station Desktop Edition, and this is going to marry together all of the various emulators that we're going to install throughout this video. And the amount of systems that you can play through Emulation Station has no limit. As long as there's an emulator for it, you will be able to launch it through here. And that includes systems up to PlayStation 3 and Nintendo Switch. Not only that, you'll be able to download box art as well as videos for each of these games, and so as you navigate through, you will be able to watch everything unfold. It's a really nice experience. In addition, there are a ton of different themes and customizations that you can do within each of these themes as well, so you can really tailor this to have the look and feel that you want as you're navigating through your systems. And so this is what we're going to strive for throughout this video. We're going to install all the emulators, then this front end, and then we'll be able to rock. Now before we get started, I have two accessories that I recommend considering. The first is going to be an external flash drive to host all of your ROMs and system files. For example, this USB-C drive from Samsung is about $25 and it has 256 gigs of storage. This means that you can put all your games onto here without taking up valuable storage internally, and you can also use it between different Macs. And I think 256 gigs is a lot of space for these games, but they also sell a 512 gigabyte model as well. The other thing I would recommend is a controller, and there are a ton of options here. Today I'm going to recommend this one, which is the 8BitDo Pro 2. This one is a neat mix between retro and modern. It obviously looks like a Super Nintendo controller, but it has those PlayStation style grips as well. It also has PlayStation style thumbsticks in case you want to play more modern games. It also has full analog triggers, which is going to be great for systems like GameCube. And it has a removable battery pack. In case you run out of battery while playing, you can actually just throw in two AA batteries instead. But also bear in mind that many other controllers will work just fine. As long as they're Bluetooth and have X input, they usually will work out great. But I think for about $40, this one is also well worth it. Now to pair this one to your Mac, you're going to want to set it into X input mode, and then when you go into the Bluetooth settings, it should just show right up once you start the pairing process. From there, just connect to the controller and it will usually be recognized as an Xbox controller at that point, and you should be good to go. Okay, let's jump into the guide itself now, and we're going to start with Emulation Station Desktop Edition. This will be the front end that we'll use at the end of the video, but it's important to use it at the beginning of the video as well because it creates very important system files first. And I'll have links to everything down below in a dedicated written guide, so just find that in the video description. Either way, once you go to their website, you can scroll down and find the macOS option. Because we're using an M series device, we're going to use the macOS Apple version. Once it's downloaded, you can open up the DMG, you'll get a couple permissions things, and then after that you'll get a window that shows the app as well as the applications folder. From there, just drag and drop to move the folder over to your applications. Then, once in your applications folder, you can open it up. It's going to ask you to confirm. You can say, yeah man, I want to do it. And from there, you'll be greeted with this window. And this is basically saying, hey, we want to put all your ROM folders in a specific place. Where do you want them? And by default, it's actually going to be within your user profile, which is the internal storage. But because we have that external flash drive, we're going to use that instead. So first thing we need to do is get the name and the path of that flash drive. So let's go ahead and quit out of Emulation Station, and we're going to go back into our Finder window. And I've already plugged in my flash drive, and you can see I've already named it as well to OpenEmu. So what you want to do now is just click on the drive and then go up to your View section within Finder, and then choose Show Path Bar. This is going to show the OpenEmu icon on the bottom of your window. And from there, you can right click on it and then select Copy as Path Name. That's going to give us the data that we need to put into Emulation Station. And so now we're going to open up the app again, and now under Change ROM Directory, we're going to select that. From there, we can delete the configured path and then paste in that one that we just copied. And it should look like this, /volume/ whatever the name of your flash drive is. Once you have that done, it's going to give you a prompt saying that we've saved everything, and it'll restart the application. Now, because we don't have any games or anything there, what we want to do next is go to the next option, which is Create Directories. This is going to make a bunch of folders for all the systems that we want to emulate, and then we'll drag and drop our ROMs into there. So once that's done, we can go ahead and quit out of the application, and now within the OpenEmu drive, you can see that we have a bunch of blank folders. And so this is where you want to drag and drop each of your ROMs for all your systems. Now, as you probably already know, ROM files are copyrighted, and so you're going to be on your own to find them. I'm not going to have any links to any of that stuff here. And so you'll have to build your own ROM library and then move all the files into the flash drive. And if you ever get lost in terms of which files you're supposed to be using or which folder means which system, you can actually go into each of the folders and there will be a file there called systeminfo.txt. If you open that up, it'll actually show you all the file extensions that it supports, and it'll also tell you the name of the system as well. And so that's a very easy way to just verify that you are dragging the right files into the right folder. And so depending on whether or not you already have your own ROM library, this might be the most tedious part of the entire guide because you will have to find them on your own. Now, another thing that we need to set up as well is going to be a BIOS folder. We need to put all of our BIOS system files inside of one place. What I generally like to do is just take that flash drive and then make a new folder and then call it BIOS, and that's where I'm going to put all those system files. Now, BIOS files are a lot like ROM files. These are also copyrighted, so you're going to be on your own to find these as well. However, I can at least show you the names of the files that you're going to want to be looking for. And so this is then broken out right here, and this will help you in your search. In the end, this is what my BIOS folder looks like after I've added all of these files. Again, this can also be a tedious process in case you don't have all of these yourself. So now let's flash forward and assume you've already added all your ROMs and BIOS files and we are ready to move on. If we go in and open up Emulation Station, you will see that all of the folders are already populated. So every system that has a ROM inside of it, and it's the correct ROM, you'll actually see it within Emulation Station. However, if you try to open up any of these, nothing's going to happen because Emulation Station is just a front end. You have to actually install and configure all the emulators as well. And so that's why we're getting an error that's not allowing us to open any of these games. So let's jump into that part next. Now we're going to install and configure each of these emulators one at a time, and we're going to start with the biggest beast of them all. It's going to be RetroArch. And behind all of these very intrusive ads is one of the most powerful apps that you can find when it comes to retro gaming. However, it is quite a pain to actually get set up, so this will probably be the longest chapter of all the emulators that we're going to cover. But it'll also allow us to emulate just about all of the retro systems, everything basically up through like Dreamcast, PS1, Nintendo 64, and Sega Saturn. I use RetroArch for all those. To start, let's go to the Downloads page, and then we're going to scroll down until we find the Apple section. And from here, just click on the link that says Download Universal. Once you have it downloaded, you can open up the DMG and it'll show the app in the Applications folder, and you can just drag and drop. From there, in the Applications folder, you can open up RetroArch. It's going to ask, do you really want to open it? And you're going to say, yeah, man, I want to do it. When you first open it up, it's going to look pretty ugly, and so this is where a lot of people get confused. Let's walk through the update process. And for this part, I do recommend having your controller already plugged in. First thing, we're going to go into the main menu and then go into Online Updater. And you want to scroll down, and all those things that say Update Something, click on each of these one at a time. This will update things like the core info files and your assets and everything else. And as you start updating these, you will see that RetroArch will start to look a little bit prettier. Anyway, once you've gone through and updated all of these, we are now ready to actually start the configuration. Now we're going to back out and go into Settings and then scroll down until you find Drivers. And then under Menu Drivers, I like to change mine to XMB. I've always really liked this navigation setup, which looks like a PS3. So once you have that set up, you can go into the main menu again, and now go into Configuration File, Save Current Configuration. This is basically just saving the fact that we want to try a different menu interface next time. So now we're going to quit out of RetroArch and then open it up again. And you can see that we have a lovely new PS3 style interface, and I like the verticality of this one. And so this is what we're going to use in our setup. So now let's go through the settings in sequential order, starting with the user interface. Within here, I like to go into on-screen notifications and then turn on display frame rate. This means on the top right, I will see the frames per second showing, which is really handy when certain games are showing slowdown. And this obviously is totally optional. Back in the main settings menu, let's now go down to the next one, which is going to be video. And here we've only got one setting to change. We should go into the full screen mode and then start in full screen mode, turn this one on. This is going to make all the games take up the entire screen. Now, if you've got an HDR capable display, you can also turn on HDR and play your games that way. Personally, I like to keep them just kind of the classic style, but this is where you would turn it on. Next, we're going to go into the input section. This is probably one of the more important sections to make changes to. If we go into the RetroPad Bind section, you can find the Port 1 controls, and this is going to have all the different controls for your controller. By default, if you are using X input, these should all correspond accordingly, so I wouldn't really worry about this, but if you're running into any problems, this is where you can change out the buttons. The main thing we want to change is going to be back in the main input settings menu, and it's called Hotkeys. These allow us to make quick settings changes on the fly with our controller without having to jump back into the menu. And here's a diagram just to show you what I recommend setting up for the most basic RetroArch setup. Your most important button will be the Hotkey Enable button, which I generally set to select. What this means is you have to press this button first plus any of the others to actually make anything happen. So for example, pressing select and start will quit out of your game and take you back to your menu. Or pressing select and R2 will toggle on fast forward. Select and R1 will save your state, and select and L1 will load that save state. And you can also toggle your frames per second with the Y button, or then also bring up the RetroArch menu with the X button. And that's essentially how I set everything up. So Hotkey Enable is going to be the select button, and then my menu toggle button will be the X button. My quit button is going to be the start button, and so on and so forth. Another thing I recommend doing is go into the menu controls. There's an option here to swap the OK and cancel buttons. And this is just within RetroArch itself, but if you don't like pressing the A or the B button for the OK button, this is where you can swap it out instead. Personally, I do like to turn this one on because then it will coincide to the menu buttons within Emulation Station as well. And then finally, near the bottom of the input section, there's an option for Confirm Quit. This means you have to press select and start 2 times in order to quit out of your game. Personally, I don't like having to press it twice, so I like to turn this one off. And that's it for the input settings. Let's go back to the main settings menu and now go into the saving section. And within here, I like to turn on auto save state and auto load state. This means that anytime I close out of a game, it's going to save it. And then when I load that game back up, it's going to go right back to where I was. Further down in the settings menu, there's the achievement section. This is where you can sign in with your retroachievements.org login. This is a neat feature that works like Xbox achievements or PlayStation trophies, but for your retro games. It's really fun. You can sign up for a free account at retroachievements.org and then just use your credentials here. Of note, by default, hardcore mode is going to be turned on, which is going to disable things like save states and rewind. So if you want to use features like this, you'll want to turn off hardcore mode, which is what I do. And then finally, the last thing we need to do in the settings menu is go down to the directory section. And the first option here is going to be system/BIOS. So we need to point this to the BIOS folder that we created earlier on our flash drive. And after you select it, we're going to choose parent directory to move back into the system file menu. As you start moving back, it's going to ask for special permissions to access certain folders, just allow everything. And at some point you'll get to your Mac's main system folder. And here just scroll down until you find the option that says volumes. After that, you should be able to find your flash drive, so go ahead and click on that. It's again probably going to ask you for permissions, and then from there, scroll down until you find your BIOS folder. Once you've opened up your BIOS folder, select use this directory and you are good to go. Now that we've got all that set up, we're going to go back into the main menu, then we're going to go down to configuration file, save current configuration. And at this point, we've changed all of our settings, and the only thing we have left is to now install a bunch of cores or emulators within RetroArch. And you can do these all one at a time and piecemeal it depending on the systems that you're going to play. And you'll find this under Online Updater and then Core Downloader. On the written guide that I'll have linked down below, I'll list out all the cores that I personally use, but of course you can just kind of go through here and decide which ones you want to try. And there's no harm in downloading a bunch of cores and seeing what they're going to be like. And so this is what I would recommend doing, is just kind of scrolling through saying, hey, I'd like to play this system, and download the core. Of course, you're still going to need that ROM file and any of the corresponding BIOS files if they're required. But essentially, this is your chance to go through and download all of the emulator systems that you want to actually play within RetroArch. And once you're done with that, we are finished configuring the RetroArch system. We've got a couple other things to do, but for now, that's pretty good. Now we can go back and open up Emulation Station again, and we should be able to launch some of our retro systems. But one thing worth noting, you have to point Emulation Station to the correct emulator core that you want to use. And of course, you also have to have that core downloaded within RetroArch first. So to do this, you'll want to press Start in the Emulation Station menu, and then scroll down until you find Other Settings. From there, under Alternative Emulators, you'll see a listing of all the systems that you have ROMs for, and then the default emulator that Emulation Station has already chosen for you. And for the most part, these actually will correspond to the RetroArch cores that I prefer to use, and so it's usually pretty plug and play. But there are a couple that are different. For example, with NES, I prefer to use the Nestopia core, so within here, I'm going to choose that. And we'll talk more about this later once we have the other emulators set up, but for now, let's try actually starting up a game and seeing if it works. Now, the first time you start up a game, it is going to ask you to allow Emulation Station Desktop Edition to access your documents folder. So you're going to have to allow that the first time, and then after that, you won't have to worry about it again. And sure enough, here we are, we're able to start up a game. And if I press select and start, it's going to close everything out and I will be back in the Emulation Station menu. Not only that, if I open up the game again, you can see that it's auto-loading exactly where I was before. So all the auto-save state stuff is working correctly. Now, RetroArch is a very powerful platform, but it does require some setup in order to configure it the way you want. So let's say you're playing a Game Boy Advance game like this, and you want to add a grid overlay to make it look more like an original console. So to do this, we're going to press Select and X to bring up the RetroArch menu, and then we're going to scroll down to the bottom to find the Shaders section. Within here, we're going to turn on the shaders, then go into Load Preset, and then Shader Slang. From there, I recommend going into the Handheld folder for Game Boy Advance. And you can try any of these shaders, but the most common one that people like to use is one called LCD3X. So let's go ahead and choose that one, and then we're going to back out, go to the main menu, and then resume our game. And so you can see that we now have a grid overlay. It kind of looks like playing a Game Boy Advance screen, but on your TV. Of course, you're not limited to just grid overlays. If you wanted to try something really crazy, like a CRT, you could do that as well. So let's try this one, CRT Geom Deluxe. Obviously, the original Game Boy Advance did not run through a CRT, but it's still a pretty cool effect, and it makes your games look very retro. Either way, once you found a shader that you like, you can go back into the RetroArch menu, go back into Shaders, and now select Save Preset. For this, I recommend Save Core Preset. That means that any game that you open up with this specific core is going to have that shader enabled. Now let's try a different system. Let's try the original Game Boy. This one always requires a bit of configuration. As you can see, once we start up the game, it's running in black and white, and so this doesn't really give me a Game Boy vibe. So here I'm going to press Select and X to get into the RetroArch menu again, and now I'm going to go into Core Options. Within here, under Game Boy Colorization, you can set it to Internal. By default, the internal palette is going to be DMG, which is supposed to mimic the original Game Boy look. But for me, I think it looks a little bit too green and bright, and so I think I want something a little bit more subdued. So I'm going to go back into the core options, and this time under internal palette, I'm going to change it to this one here, TWP64 Pack 1. This will allow me to use all the palettes that are right below it under the Pack 1 palette. And you should definitely experiment with all these, but my favorite is number 28, Game.com version. This one gives it a little bit more of a subdued green, and so I like this one a lot. This is what we're going to stick with. Now, also within the core options, there's something called interframe blending. This allows you to add a little bit of an LCD ghosting effect. So this is going to make the games look a little bit more old school like they did on the original Game Boy. On top of that, we can add shaders as well. In fact, the LCD 3X shader we used for Game Boy Advance works really well for this one too. And so there we go. Now, just in a couple minutes, I was able to change out the colorization, the interframe blending, and also add a shader. And so I really like the look of this now. Now, the core options are just going to save themselves when you make the change, but you do have to go in and save that shader again. So we're going to go in and then save that core preset, which actually means that when we play Game Boy Color games, which use the exact same core, all that shader stuff is going to carry over as well. So here's a Game Boy Color game. I didn't have to do anything other than just load it up, but it already has that LCD grid overlay. Now, when it comes to home console systems, one of my favorite things to do here is mess around with CRT effects. Many of these CRT shaders are really hardware intensive, but the M series chips on Macs can handle them no problem. So I'm going to go in and I'm going to open up my CRT folder. I'm going to pick that CRT Geom Deluxe one again. And so this is what it looks like with a true console system like Super Nintendo, and I think this looks amazing. It does make the game a little bit softer looking, but it also has a good amount of depth to it, and it just looks more like the original programmers intended. Another good series of shaders is the CRT Hylian shader group. This one adds a bit of sharpening to the image, but also makes it very old school looking as well, so I like this one too. And then finally, I also really like the CRT Royale group of shaders. I like the Fake Bloom version in particular because this one gives a bit of a phosphor glow. And so this one kind of looks like you're playing on a CRT television late at night, and so this just fills me with a lot of nostalgia, and they're a lot of fun to work with. Now for other systems, we can use things like resolution upscaling and widescreen cheats. Let's use Dreamcast as our example. Once we have the game loaded, we're going to open up the quick menu by pressing Select and X, and we're going to go into Core Options again. From there, go into Video, and under Internal Resolution, you can change this to whatever you would like, 1080p, 1440p, 4K, whatever you want to try. We're just going to stick with 1440p right now just because it's a pretty easy round number. In addition, under Widescreen Hacks, you can go in and turn on widescreen cheats. This isn't going to work with every game, but it is pretty awesome. You will have to close out of the game first before you can start it up, but here we are with Sonic Adventure 2, and you can see we now are playing in a full widescreen, and it's also running at a 1440p upscale. And of course, you can also overlay a bunch of shaders on top of that if you would like as well. One of my favorite systems to play on RetroArch with these heavy-duty shaders is Sega Saturn. I like to use the Beetle core, which is super accurate, and the combination of Beetle plus a nice CRT shader like the CRT Geom Deluxe one right here, it's just super awesome. And so that's RetroArch in a nutshell, and this, like I mentioned, is probably the most intensive of all the emulators to actually get set up. One other thing worth noting, especially within the RetroArch section, is that within the Emulation Station Desktop Edition guide, they have a section talking about macOS. And within here, they've got some tips in case you run into any problems with RetroArch, and so I would recommend reading through this if you do run into any problems. Okay, we made it through RetroArch. You can take a breather right now. We are now ready to set up the other standalone emulators, and these are each going to be a lot easier to set up. And let's jump into our handheld systems. Now, for things like Game Boy and Game Boy Advance, and even the original Nintendo DS, I do recommend just using the standard RetroArch cores. But other systems like PSP and Nintendo 3DS work better with standalone emulators. So let's start with PSP. And we're going to use this app right here, which you can find directly on their website. There is a gold as well as a free version, and there's no feature difference between these, it's just whether or not you want to support the developer. For now, let's just go with the free version, but obviously choose whichever one fits you the best. Once you download the app, you'll find the DMG in your downloads folder, open that up, and then same thing here, just drag the application over to your applications folder. When you try to open it up, it's going to ask, do you really want to do this, and you know what to do, and from there, it's going to open up the PSP app. Now, first thing we want to do is point it to where all of our games are stored on that external flash drive. So we're going to click on that little folder icon and then go into our OpenEmu flash drive and then navigate down to PSP. And here I'm assuming that you already have your PSP games loaded into that folder. We can now select open. Now you'll see a list of all of our games and then press that little plus button at the end of them. That's going to save this location. From there, now navigate over to the settings section, and under rendering resolution, you can now upscale this however you would like. You can do anywhere from like 4x for 1080p or 8x all the way up to 4K. Your Mac will probably be able to handle anything. We're going to use 6x as our resolution just as a nice middle ground. From there, I also recommend turning on full screen as well as VSync. And again, because we've got the power for it, you can turn on anti-aliasing as well. Let's do a full 4x. This is going to make everything look a little bit sharper and crisper. From there, we can navigate down to the bottom, and if you'd like, you can show the frames per second as well as the speed of the game playing. Of course, this is all optional. From there, I recommend going into the controls section and then select control mapping. By default, this will auto map all of your buttons, and so you probably don't have to make any configuration changes here, but there is one hotkey that I want to set up. So scroll all the way down to the bottom, then select this option on the left that says Allow Combo Mappings. From there, you'll see an option that says Exit App, and for this, I like to press Select and Start. That way, it's going to function a lot like RetroArch. It'll close out of your game when you press those two buttons together. And really, other than that, there's not a lot else to configure. We can go to the Tools section, and if you'd like, you can sign into your Retro Achievements username and password here as well. It's going to be the exact same credentials that we used in RetroArch, but it'll work with this app too. And really, that's it when it comes to setting up PSP. We've got all of our games loaded up. We've got our configuration set up. It'll also work with Emulation Station. And so this is one of the easier systems to set up. Let's move on to another one that's actually surprisingly easy. For Nintendo 3DS, we're going to use Lime 3DS. Now, this app is actually no longer in development because the team is now working with other creators to make a new app. However, they were also kind enough to archive this one and make it read-only, so we can still grab it from their GitHub. And again, links to all of these emulators will be found in the written guide linked down below. Now, once you get to this page, just download the macOS Universal zip file. And after unzipping it, you will get this folder right here. You can open it up. You'll see a bunch of files. You don't need any of them other than the Lime 3DS app file. So just drag this one into your applications folder and you'll be good to go. But when you try to open this app within the applications folder, you'll get that whole workaround saying that it can't open it up. So again, here we're going to have to go into the privacy section within your system settings, then scroll down till you find that open anyway. Once you click on that, it'll ask you for your user password and then you will be good to go. You only have to do this once per app. And so this is what the window is going to look like here. So let's go ahead and set up Lime 3DS. It's pretty easy. We're going to double click on the center menu and then navigate to our 3DS folder. And again, I've already got my games in the flash drive and they're in the N3DS folder. And now back in the main window, you should see all those games loaded up. Now let's start the configuration. We're going to go up to the top into Lime 3DS and then Preferences. It's going to ask permission to use your microphone. That's because some games require it, so we're going to allow it. Under the General tab, all we have to do here is just uncheck the thing that says Confirm Exit when the emulation is running. Next, in the Graphics tab, we want to change out our internal resolution. Again, you can use whatever you would like. I'm just going to go with like a 4x resolution here. Now, under the Controls section, we want to configure our controller. This is also super easy with this app. All you have to do is just press this Auto Map button here at the bottom. It's going to say that after pressing OK, press any button on your joystick. So let's go ahead and hit OK, and then I'm going to press any button on my gamepad. And that's going to auto map all of the controls to my controller, so I'm good to go. Next, back up in that menu bar, let's go up to View and then toggle on Full Screen. And then also within that View menu, we've got other different screen layouts we can mess with. I prefer the one that says Large Screen. This is going to make the top screen very big and then the bottom screen a little bit smaller, which usually is only used for like touch input. And honestly, that's it when it comes to setting up Lime 3DS. It is very simple. You just got to make sure you've got the correct games and everything will run fine. And I found that usually a 4x resolution gets me the best performance. You'll still get some slowdown here and there. This is an app that's still kind of a work in progress, but yeah, you'll be able to play a lot of 3DS games this way. Okay, next we're going to set up Dolphin, which is the emulator that you can use for GameCube and Nintendo Wii. This one's pretty easy to set up, but the controls can be pretty tricky, so we'll walk through all that. On the website, you have two major releases that you can download, the actual release or a development version. The dev ones are updated almost every day, and so you can live on the edge to get that one, but the real releases come out every few months and they're pretty stable, so we're going to go with that right now. And same thing here, open the DMG, then drag the app over into the Applications folder, and when you try to open it up, it's going to ask you to confirm, and there we go. If you want, you can report information to the developers, it's all up to you. Now in the main window, just double click on it and you can add your games directory. So we'll navigate to our external drive down to GC for GameCube and then pick that. Now this will also emulate Wii games, so we need to add those as well, but it's not as easy as double clicking on the front window again. Instead, you'll click on the config button and then go into paths and then add it from here. It's kind of weird that you have to do this for 2 different systems, but this is the way to get Wii up and running. Okay, so now we have all of our games listed. Let's make some configuration changes. We'll start by going back into the main configuration page, and in the general section, I like to turn on enable cheats. Under the interface section, I like to go and turn off confirm on stop and then also the use panic handlers. Other than that, we don't really have to make any other major changes to the config file, so let's go into the graphics section next. In the general tab, I like to turn on VSync so I don't get any screen tearing and then also have it start in full screen. In the Enhancements tab, this is where you can upgrade the internal resolution. And for most M-series chips, you can go all the way up to 4K, so it's really going to be up to you. Now, near the bottom, you'll see there's an option for widescreen hacks, but I actually don't recommend this because it can be pretty buggy. So if you are looking to use widescreen hacks, then I recommend using widescreen cheat codes for each of these games, which you can find on the Dolphin website. And then finally, in the Advanced tab, you can turn on things like your frames per second if you want to see those while you're playing a game. Now let's go to set up our actual controllers, and this can be a little bit tricky. In the controller section, we need to set up both GameCube as well as Wii. Let's do GameCube first. Let's click on the configure button, and this is where we'll map our keys, and these have to be done one at a time. Now here's a diagram of the way that I like to use my GameCube layout. So essentially I'm trying to mimic the location of the buttons as much as possible. And so the way I think of it is that I put the A button in the center right there in the bottom, and then I put all the other buttons around it. It's not the exact same geography as the original GameCube controller, which you can see on the top right of this diagram, but I think this is probably the closest. We're also going to set up some hotkeys like being able to quit and save and load a state as well, so we'll do that here in a moment. So to set this up, the first thing you have to do is under Device, change it to the Xbox One S controller, and then just go through and map all these buttons like I did with the diagram. Now when you get to the L and R buttons, it can be a little bit tricky depending on whether or not the controller that you're using has an analog trigger input. If it does, then you can just use the trigger for both the L and the L analog and so on. But if it doesn't, you will have to set it up as L and R as the trigger buttons, or the L and R2, and then the analog input you can set up as the shoulder keys instead. It all really comes down to the layout of the controller that you're using, but you can kind of intuit it based on what you have to work with. Now when it comes to Nintendo Wii, this one is even trickier. So we're going to set up just one major profile that will cover like all of our Wii and Nunchuck inputs. And so let me walk you through this really quickly so you get an idea of what's going on. To start, I have mapped out my A, B, and 1 and 2 buttons in a way that makes the most sense for me when you're holding a Wiimote. In addition, for my left analog stick, that is the Nunchuck analog stick, but for the right analog stick, that's actually the pointer of the Wiimote itself. In addition, for the Nunchuck, I put my C and Z buttons on L1 and L2 because you're going to be holding the Nunchuck in your left hand, which is where that left analog stick is, so this makes the most sense for me. So to set this up, you'll go and hit the configure button over by the Wii remote section. And then from there, again, just follow the diagram and input these buttons as needed. In the general options section, this is where you'll put in all the face buttons as well as your D-pad directions. You can also insert a sideways toggle, which will be great for games like Paper Mario. I use L3 for this. Now under motion simulation, I do 2 things. Number 1, when it comes to shaking the remote, I like to use my R1 or shoulder button. And then under the pointer, this is where you're going to put in your right analog stick inputs. Next, we're going to go into the extension tab. This is for the Nunchuck inputs. So here for the directions, I'm going to use the left analog stick input, and then for C and Z, I'll use L1 and L2. Finally, the last thing I like to do is under extension motion simulation, again for shake, I like to set all of these to R1. This means when playing a game like New Super Mario Bros. Wii, when you press that button, it's going to make your character spin. And really that's it when it comes to setting up Wii mode on a traditional controller. It's not going to be a perfect equivalent, but many games will be playable this way. But honestly, if you're going to be using specialized Wii controls, for example, like a Guitar Hero game or something that is really pointer friendly, then I would recommend just using a standard Wiimote, which you can do in this app. I just recently made a whole video showing how to do this, not only on desktop, including a Mac, but also on Android, and so I'll leave that link down below. Once we're done with our standard controls, now all we have to do is set up our hotkeys. This is going to be in a different option, so we'll go into Options and then Hotkey Settings. First thing you have to do is change your device from keyboard over to your controller. From there, you can set whatever you would like, so for Exit, I'm going to do Select and Start. In addition, under Disable Emulation Speed Limit, this is my fast forward, so I'll do Select and R2. Just note this is not a toggle, you'll have to hold this down in order to actually fast forward. Under the graphics tab, I like to adjust the internal resolution using up and down on my D-pad. So that way, if I'm getting slowdown in any game, I can just decrease it by pressing my hotkey and then down, and that's super simple. And then finally, under save and load states, I like to save and load to the selected slot using L1 and R1. And really, that's it when it comes to setting up Dolphin. So let's start up a GameCube game. Yes, this is working perfectly and in 4K. And then, of course, same thing with Nintendo Wii. We can start up a game, and yeah, this is working great as well. Okay, next we're going to grab PCSX2, which is our PS2 emulator. This one also has nightly and stable versions. We're going to go with the stable version here. Once you have it unzipped, you can drag and drop the file into your applications folder like with the others. From there, double click on it, and then yeah man, I want to do it. Now a lot of the configuration is actually done in the welcome screen, which is really handy. For example, in the BIOS image section, this is where we're going to pick our BIOS files. I've already added mine to my flash drive in the BIOS folder, so I just have to point to that. And there are plenty of different PS2 BIOS that will work with this application. This is just one of many. On the next page, it's going to ask you to point to wherever your games are located. And so again, we're going to hit add and then go to our flash drive and then navigate to PS2 and then open. It's going to ask you, do you want to scan the directory recursively? And you only need to do this if you have subfolders within that folder. I do not, so I'm going to hit no. On the next page, we're going to set up our controller, and this is super simple as well. All we have to do is just hit automatic mapping and then choose our controller, and we are actually good to go. So this is what the main PCSX2 interface is going to look like. Let's go down into settings and then graphics to make some changes. For the renderer and adapter, you can just keep it at auto, but I also like to set it to metal and Apple M4. Further down, we can apply widescreen patches as well as no interlacing patches, and I do think these work really well, so I do turn them on. Now under rendering, we can change the internal resolution to whatever you would want. You want to upscale it to 4K, go for it. I'm going to do 1440p in this example. Another thing I like to do is change the blending accuracy to high. Many games will require this, and instead of having to go and change it on a per game basis, we've got enough power to just leave it at that. Further down in the OSD tab, this is where you can turn on frames per second if you'd like to see that. Next, we're going to go up to the interface section. Here we can turn off the confirm shutdown so we don't have to get a warning, and we can also select it to start in full screen, which is going to be really handy. Near the bottom of the settings options, we have the ability to turn on achievements. Again, here you can just use your Retro Achievements login, just like with the other apps. This one does have a hardcore mode, so you can decide whether or not you want to use it. And then finally, we need to set up our hotkeys or shortcuts. We'll go into settings and hotkeys. And here it's super simple. We just want to add the hotkey to whatever action we want. For example, the open pause menu will bring up the in-game menu. So for this, I like to do select an X. You can also toggle the frame limit, which is going to be faster than fast forward. So I like to do that one with select an R2. Further down, we can shut down the virtual machine, which is the same thing as basically closing the game. For this, I'm going to assign select and start. We can also set up our save states with our right and left shoulder buttons. In the end, here's a diagram of everything that we just did. So the hotkey enable is going to be select for most things. And this is where I can shut down the virtual machine or toggle the frame limiter and so on. Again, all this really follows the same function as the other emulator apps. That way you don't have to memorize them on a per app basis. So let's go ahead and start up a game and see if it works. We're going to do Burnout Revenge, and yeah, look at that. It's upscaled, also with widescreen, so yeah, everything's good to go. And I think this is awesome because there's something like 2,000 PS2 games available, and so this is a huge library to play around with. One final thing before we move on, in the Applications folder, you need to rename this app to just PCSX2.app. You need to do this in order for Emulation Station to actually launch the app, and so it's just a quick fix and do that one time. Now, sticking with the same generation, let's do Zemu or XEmu. This is the original Xbox emulator. This one will already detect that you're on macOS, so you can just download the app right there. Once you have it unzipped, you will find the Zemu app. Just drag this over to your Applications folder. It's going to give you one of those security errors, so go into the settings and then go to Privacy and Security, and then scroll down till you find the app and then hit Open Anyway. At this point, you probably know exactly what to do. Once you get the app open, this is what it's going to look like. We're going to click on the settings button. First thing it's going to ask you to do is identify all of your BIOS files. And again, I have all of these on my flash drive within the BIOS folder. So I'm going to click on one of them and then go into that folder. The boot ROM starts with the words MCPX, so you can choose it from there. Next, for the flash ROM or the BIOS file, this one is going to start with the word complex. There are two different versions of this one. I like to use the one that is 1.03. And then finally, for the hard drive, you'll find the one that's named Xbox_HDD. And again, because these are BIOS files, you'll have to find them on your own. Once you're done with that, let's go into Input, and all we have to do here is just identify our controller. Next, we can go into the Display section. If you'd like, you can upscale it, but performance is not great on this app, so don't go too crazy. In addition, you can also turn it on to be full screen at startup. And really, that's about it. All we have to do at this point is just exit out of the app and then open it up again. And you'll know that everything is working and the BIOS are correct if you get the original Xbox boot logo. From there, it's going to go into a blank screen and say, please insert a disk. So now we want to go up into the top menu and select load disk. From there, navigate to your flash drive, then your Xbox folder, and then grab one of your ISO files. Bear in mind that these files need to go through a process called muletting. I have more information in my written guide down below. Either way, once you've chosen your disk, you go back to this black screen and now reset your console. And this then will boot directly into the game like you can see here with Halo. Now, like I mentioned, performance here is not going to be great, so I would not expect to play the entire catalog. And if you want to see your frames per second, the best way to do it is actually to go into the debug menu. So you'll go up into the top menu and then select video. And the number on the left will be your frames per second. And so this is going to be the actual system frames per second. So you can see it dipping when it goes. And so for example here, you can see that even just the original Halo does not play at a full 30 frames per second at a 2x upscale. However, there are still plenty of games like Crazy Taxi 3 that play just fine. So it's worth experimenting if you really like this catalog. Either way, that's all it really takes to set up ZEMU. It's a matter of just making sure you have the correct disks and then make sure that you do that muletting process like I mentioned before. Okay, next up we have CEMU, which is the Wii U emulator. This one is pretty easy to set up as well. When you click on download, it's going to take you to their GitHub page. Now they have a pre-release version. I tried this one out, but it actually crashed every time I tried to start a game. So instead, we're going to go to the most recent stable release, which is going to be CEMU 2.5. And of course, as the app gets updated, this number is going to get higher and higher. Either way, just grab the app that says Mac OS, and then same thing, open up the DMG, move the app over to the applications folder. And then when you open the app, you'll get that same permissions thing. And I think at this point, you probably know what to do in terms of going into the settings and all that stuff. Now, when you first open it up, it does have a quick start screen. First thing it's going to ask is, where are your games? So we're going to click on browse, then we'll navigate to our flash drive and then over to Wii U, and there are all of my games. In addition, it gives you an option to download and configure all of your graphics packs. We're not going to configure them just yet, but we will download them, so that's super handy. Once they're downloaded, just close out of this window and then go back. On the next page, just make sure you select Start Games with Full Screen, and now you can close it. You'll be greeted by a window that says, hey, all this Mac stuff is totally experimental. So really, I wouldn't expect every single game to play at full speed without any glitches. Now that we're in the main menu and we've got all of our games loaded up, let's go into the input settings. This is actually pretty easy as well. First thing, we want to make a profile. I'm just going to call mine Wii U Gamepad. Now under emulated controller, I'm just going to set it to the Wii U Gamepad. And then under controller, I'm going to hit plus, and then I'm going to go down to SDL controller. Once you have the API selected, go ahead and under controller, find your controller. Once you've got that, hit add, and then everything will be pre-mapped for you. Now all we have to do is just save our Wii U Gamepad profile. We're good to go in terms of input. Now, one thing you can do depending on the game is adjust the graphics packs. We can find this in the options section, and it's going to list out every game that you have installed that supports them. And these will be different for every single game, but in general, this is where you can do things like upscaling the resolution, and there's going to be other things like cheats and mods and stuff like that. And so if any of that sounds interesting to you, I would recommend checking out these graphics packs and see what's available per game. And really, that's about it. So you can now start up your games and it should work okay. Just bear in mind that not every game is going to work perfectly. A good example here is going to be Sonic and All-Stars Racing Transformed. This one's got some shadowing issues. If you can see in the far distance, it's really dark, and I don't think it's supposed to be like that. Either way, that's essentially how you set up Wii U. Not every single game is going to play great, but those that do really do. Okay, next we're going to try out RPCS3. This is our PlayStation 3 emulator. This one's really easy. You just want to scroll down to the Mac OS section and then grab the one that says ARM64. That's going to be for M-series chips. After you've downloaded it, you should get a 7-zip file. Go ahead and unzip this and you should see the app within there. Go ahead and drag that over to the applications folder, and same thing here, we're going to have those permission errors. So go back into the settings and you know what to do. Now once we have the app opened up, it's going to give us this quick warning, but I'll walk you through the rest of the process. So here I'm going to say I've read the quick start guide and I don't want to show this in startup. And the first thing you want to do once you have everything loaded up is load up the PS3 firmware. And thankfully you can find this one directly on Sony's website. It's super easy. In the section that says how to update PS3 system software, there's an option that says using a computer. Once we click on that, you'll get a button that says download PS3 update. So let's download that. Now back in the app settings, we're going to go to file and then install firmware. From there, you can go to your downloads folder and you'll find the PS3 update.pup file. It'll take a minute to install it, but it'll let you know that everything is is good to go. And then once that's done, it's going to compile the PPU modules. This will take maybe 20-30 seconds. You might get a warning that says that the PS3 application has crashed and that you can close it. It's fine. The next time you try to open it, it'll be okay. Now let's talk about installing games, because this can get quite complicated for PS3. Essentially, there are two different types of games that you can install. The first are going to be PS3 dumps from an actual disc. These will come in their own folder, and they'll have a bunch of subfolders within it. And so in this example, you can see I have God of War 3 set up like that. Now, in addition, there is also something called PKG/RAP files. These are going to be PSN titles. So these are digital store files that you can also run within the emulator. The PKG file will be the game itself, and then the RAP file is kind of like a decoder. So now I want to show you how to install each of these two types, because they are a little bit different. Let's start with the PS3 disc games. We're going to go to File and then select Add Games. Now we're going to navigate to our flash drive, then our PS3 folder, and there's my God of War 3 folder. Now you don't have to actually select any sort of game, just pick the folder itself and then select Open. After that, it's going to say, hey, we added the game, and just hit OK. Now let's talk about PSN files. These are a little more involved. We're going to go up to File, then Install Packages/RAP/EDATS. And here you can actually install multiple at once. I'm going to do all the PKG files, then all the RAP files. After you select them, it's going to give you a window saying, hey, you want to do a batch installation? And we're going to say, yeah. After these are loaded, you should see all the games in the file system, but they're not ready to launch just yet. We need those RAP files. So again, we'll go up to File, and then Install Packages/RAPs. And now let's pick our 3 RAP files and hit Open. You're not going to get a nice confirm box for this one, but yeah, it's going to work. Now let's start configuring things. Let's go into the pad section. This one's super easy. We need to go over to Handlers on the far left and then pick SDL. From there, it should just choose your controller automatically, and you're actually good to go at that point. Another thing we can do is we can right-click on any game, and there's an option that says Download Compatibility Database. Once you do that, on the right side, you will see whether or not the game is playable or it has in-game issues and so on. Now we've got one other thing to change. If we go into the config section and we go over to the far right into the emulator tab, near the bottom on the left side, you'll see an option that says Start Games in Full Screen Mode. And now we should be able to launch any of our games. So if I click on Tokyo Jungle and then hit play, after a few minutes of compiling some of those shaders and PPU modules, the game will start right up. And at that point, we can actually delete all of our PKG and RAP files because they've been installed internally. This is one of those quirks of RPCS3. Unfortunately, it will take up some internal storage. And so definitely don't go nuts with installing PSN titles if you want to keep your internal storage really trim. When it comes to disk-based games like God of War 3, those can just reside directly on the flash drive, so those might be better if you have larger games. Now, in order for these games to show up in Emulation Station, we have to create shortcuts and then put them in our PS3 folder. To do that, we're going to right-click on each game, then go down to Manage Game and select Create Desktop Shortcut. And you'll have to do this one by one for each of these games. Once you've got these shortcuts created, then drag them over into your PS3 folder on your flash drive. And this allows Emulation Station to see that you have the game and then know where to launch it as well. At that point, you can also delete the shortcuts that are on the actual desktop. We don't need those anymore. And that's really it when it comes to basic setup, but if you want to go a little bit more into the weeds, you can go into the config section, and then under GPU, you can actually change the resolution scale on a per game basis or for the whole system. You're going to do that with this slider in the center, and it's already going to be set at 100% or 720p. But you could always bring it up to like 300% for 4K or 200% for 1440p. It's all up to you. In addition, it's worth noting that every single game in the PS3 catalog sometimes requires its own special configuration. And the best way to figure that out is to right-click on the game in the system menu and then select Check Game Compatibility. This will take you to the RPCS3 website, and from there you can choose your game and then read about any special configurations that they recommend. It's not going to tell you every single thing that you need to do, but it's going to give you a lot of helpful information. For some of the really hard to play games like God of War 3 or Metal Gear Solid 4, it's worth looking at a couple special configuration YouTube videos just to make sure you got it locked in. But really, that's about it when it comes to setting up PS3. It seems like a really daunting process, but it's really all about just getting the game files and then pointing them in the right place. Okay, finally, we've got one more emulator to talk about. This is Ryujinx. Now, this is a Nintendo Switch emulator that was recently taken down offline, much like with Yuzu. We're still not really sure what the circumstances are about this, but luckily there are many archives still available online, and so it's very easy to find them. I'm not going to provide any links or anything, so you'll have to find them on your own, but easiest thing to do is just type in the words Ryujinx and archive in Google and you should find something. Regardless, if you get to a screen like this, the app that we're looking for is going to be labeled as Release and macOS Universal. So once you have that downloaded, go ahead and unzip this file and you should see the Ryujinx app within. Now just drag it over to your applications folder and then open it up. You're going to get that same old song and dance in terms of security permissions and going into your system settings, but after that you'll be good to go. Once you open up the app, it's going to give you a warning that it cannot find your prod keys file. And that's fine, just go ahead and hit OK. And now we need to load our 2 files required to run Nintendo Switch games. The first one is the prod keys file. This is going to be required to be able to recognize and run your games. And Ryujinx is also special in that it requires a firmware file as well. The numbers on these will change over time as well, but as of making this video, firmware 19 is about the most updated. And to install these, it's pretty easy. Let's start by going into File and then open Ryujinx folder. Within there, you'll find a folder named System. Open that one up. And within this system folder, add your prod keys file, and that's it. Next, we need to install our firmware. So we'll go into Tools, Install Firmware, and then Install from a zip file. Now we just need to navigate to our folder that has the firmware zip file and then select it. It's going to ask, do you really want to install it? And you're going to do, yeah, man, I want to do it. Now once we have that done, let's start the configuration. We're going to go into Options and then toggle on the thing that says Start in Full Screen Mode. Next, go into the Settings, and then you'll see under General there's a Confirm Exit dialog thing. We're going to turn that off. Now under Game Directories, we just need to point to wherever we have our Switch games. So this is going to be in my flash drive and then the Switch folder. And Ryujinx works with a bunch of different file types, but I prefer NSP or XCI files, and all mine here are NSP. Next, let's go into the Input tab, and here under Input Device, just choose your controller. It's going to auto-map everything. There's also a hotkeys section, but unfortunately you can't use any controller hotkeys. They're only for keyboard hotkeys, and so this isn't really helpful. The only other option I would recommend checking out is going to be in the Graphics tab. Under the resolution scale, you can adjust this if you would like. I'd recommend trying out a 2x resolution scale. This is going to give you a 4K when in docked mode. And really, that's about it. So now you can just double click on the game and it'll start up and all your controls should work fine. Bear in mind that because this was an incomplete emulator, not every single game is going to run well. In addition, Ryujinx has always been aimed towards accuracy over speed, and so some games may have slowdown. Either way, that's how you would set everything up when it comes to Ryujinx, and so now we're good with the emulator portion of this video. Now that we've got everything set up, let's wrap everything together in Emulation Station Desktop Edition to make everything pretty. And right off the bat, you can see that we have all of our systems showing because we've added our ROM files like we mentioned before. Next, we want to open up the main menu by pressing Start and then go into Other Settings and Alternative Emulators. We kind of looked at this already with the RetroArch section, but now we can really dial in which emulator we're going to start with each system. For example, by default, under GameCube and Wii, it's going to have the Dolphin core within RetroArch instead of the standalone emulator set. So this one we do want to change to Dolphin Standalone. Same thing with 3DS, it's going to be set to Citra, but we're using Lime 3DS, so I'm going to change that. And then finally, the last one is going to be for PSP. Make sure it's set to the standalone app instead of the RetroArch core, and after that, we're good. So let's go ahead and try out a game and see if it works. So let's go into the Switch one, we're going to open up Cuphead. And sure enough, there it goes. It started up the game, it went to full screen, and so everything is good to go. However, one thing to bear in mind is that this app in particular doesn't have a hotkey to exit out of it, so you will need a keyboard and mouse, unfortunately. There are some workarounds for it, and I'll leave a little bit of that information in the written guide down below. Now, one of my favorite things about Emulation Station are all of its themes. Let me show you how to change a couple of them if you would like. We're going to go back into the main menu, then into UI settings and theme downloader. It's going to give you a quick warning, and then it'll download all of the theme repositories. And from there, you can basically just shop for whatever themes you like. So you can navigate through. If something looks pretty fancy, then you can choose to download it. I'm going to grab a couple here, including Canvas as well as Artbook next. Now, back in the UI settings section, I'm going to go into the theme section. You can see I've got a bunch to choose from. Let's pick the Canvas one first, and this is what it's going to look like right out of the box. I think it looks pretty cool. However, a lot of these themes have additional configurations you can do within the UI settings menu. So for example, within this one, I can choose the color scheme to be retro instead. And so there we go, now we've got a bit of a brighter theme to work with. We can also change out the overall feel of this by going from a grid to a carousel function. And so now you can navigate through all your systems one at a time. So now let's go ahead and scrape our box art. This is going to be all the stuff that makes the themes look really good. We're going to go into the scraper section, and then under scrape these systems, we're going to go all the way down to the bottom and select All. Now under account settings, you need to add your username and password from screenscraper.fr. This is also free to sign up, and so you just have to go to the website and create your credentials. After that, I recommend going down into the other settings section because there's going to be a region selection, and by default it'll be Europe, but for me, I like to use USA. And that's it. You can now press start and it'll start to scrape all the games that you have within Emulation Station. You can see here I have 508 games, and that's going to take about an hour altogether to scrape all this information. However, once it's done, it's going to look awesome. If we go into any of these menus, like Sega Genesis, you can see here that, yeah, we can scroll through and see all of our box art and lovely screenshots and everything. In addition, if we hover over the game for a moment, it's going to show a video playback to give you an idea of what the game's going to be like. So I love this. In addition, once you've scraped it one time, you are good to go. So for example, if we change out the theme, if we go into the themes and say, let's do art book next, as we scroll through, you can see that as we get into the games list, it's still going to show the box art and everything. So we're good to go. And also, like I mentioned before, you can toggle all sorts of stuff within each of these themes. For example, within art book next, if we go into the color scheme, we can change it to other options like outline, which is one of my favorites. This one is really vibrant and colorful, and so I like navigating through this one as well. One last thing, if you're wondering about which theme I was using right in the very beginning, which had a nice grid but all the controllers, it's this one here. Essentially, it's canvas with a grid text list and then the controller set to retro. And so this is what it looks like right here, which is the current one I'm running on my Mac, and I think it looks really cool. And finally, one last tip. If you want to get to Emulation Station really easily, just drag the application from your Applications folder into your dock. That way you can just grab it at any time. You can also right-click on the game and then select Open at Login, which is going to make Emulation Station start up when you start up the computer. Of course, it's all going to be up to you and how often you plan on playing these retro games, but at least now I've given you all the tools to get up and running. And so really, that's about it for this video. I just wanted to show you the very basics in getting all these emulators to work in macOS, and then also some of the configurations that I recommend. There is still plenty of other things that you can do within each of these, but I think this is enough to make you really dangerous. I'll have a written guide linked down below in case you have any further questions or need a little bit more guidance. And as always, thank you for watching. Be sure to like and subscribe if you found this helpful, and we will see you next time. Happy gaming.